hop right into it. And I just wanted to know off the bat, in November, you called for Barrie residents to get involved and use the budget allocation tool on the website. What did you learn from that process, or what did the city learn from that?
Yeah, well, we'll actually get the summary of all of that data on Monday night as part of our staff. Well, we'll actually, I guess, when the agenda is posted tomorrow. But I think what that allowed us to do is present some of the choices. And inevitably, when you've got an allocator, you're kind of creating some arbitrary choices because you know the way that tool works, you offset one with the other and sort of tell us about somebody's priorities. It tells us a little bit about the community's priorities. I often find the written comments to be, in many ways, the most useful. Yes, it's interesting to see how people played with the sliders and where their numbers ended up, and certainly the trends in that would tell you what people's relative priorities are, at least the ones who use the allocator tool. But it's the written comments often, and some people, you know, it's just one or two lines. Other people give us thoughtful essays in those comments, and that often gives a lot more color to why they made the choices they did. There's an unusually high desire to keep the tax increase very low because people are very concerned about their household budget. And that's pretty understandable because of the degree of economic uncertainty right now around COVID. And the number of people who, you know, were laid off for at least part of 2020 or are at risk of being laid off, and perhaps they're, you know, because sick leave is weak in Canada, you know, they didn't get their income replaced, and the economic situation is just tougher. So, and we know unemployment is twice what it was a year ago. So I think that explains, came through in the replies. I think in terms of the spending priorities, that may also explain why we had even more of a focus on do the basics. But I haven't seen the final numbers yet, so I'm not sure whether that was borne out in the full spectrum of responses.
And many who've contacted me before I did this interview and throughout my first weeks on the job were talking about the police budget, and specifically what they don't want is an increase to that budget. How do you respond to those who say the city shouldn't be using more taxpayer money to fund the service this year?
Yeah, and it was interesting because there was a survey, the police actually did a survey of exactly that, who believes they should have an increase, who believes they shouldn't, why or why not. And when you actually take a large sample, rather than the people who come forward on that issue, are much more across the spectrum. You have people who believe the police actually should get more money, and obviously there's a strong movement right now that says police should get either no increase or defunded. My concern about doing a zero for the police is our community is not a zero. We're growing. And in fact, under COVID and with the kind of social challenges that we're seeing the police have to respond to in our community, their calls are going up. So if you leave the budget at zero and you say you're not going to provide any additional capacity, then the existing capacity has to do more, or you need to move those calls to someone else. And that, which is the core idea of the defunding movement, is actually something we've been working on for years in Barrie. And even the police themselves believe that they're being asked to do things that they shouldn't be asked to do, and by default, because they're the ones who are open at 3 a.m. and nobody else is. So, you know, I've been saying for quite a while in response to those who've asked for that we need, first of all, we need a systemic review of the police. And out of that will come ways that we can shift some of those non-criminal calls to others. And so should the budget. So if CMHA, for example, the Canadian Medical Association, ends up being an organization that can take 5,000 of the 75,000 calls that the Barrie Police respond to every year, then they should get a chunk of the funding to do that. But one of the other challenges, and I've talked about this a lot, is you got to build up that capacity at the other partners before you take it away from the police. And a lot of people say, well, why can't you just switch it over? It does take a little bit of time, and it needs to be done well and thoughtfully. And I think that's underway right now. So to those who say we should defund, I think the answer is I agree that we should pursue alternate service delivery. I don't believe you can just cut the police budget until you build up the capacity in the other service providers.
So how do you go about, as mayor, how do you go about kind of motivating some of these changes or reviewing these policies in the next few years as Barrie grows?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have an initiative called the Barrie Health Accord, which is the Barrie Police, the City of Barrie, the County of Simcoe, Royal Victoria Hospital, and our public health unit. The five of us in November signed a agreement, the Accord, which says we're all going to focus on spending more time, attention, and money on the social determinants of health, moving our investment upstream to address the root causes of why emergency services are so busy. What brought the five of us together is we all function in the emergency service world, with the possible exception of the public health unit, although they're doing a lot right now when you respond to a pandemic. But you got a hospital with an emergency room that's frequently jammed with people who don't need to be in the ER. You've got a police service responding to calls that they don't need to be responding to, an ambulance service at the County of Simcoe that's doing the same thing. And the costs are just spiraling because it's responsive, it's reactive. And so the core need is for all of us to invest in the root causes and build the capacity, whether that's in housing, in education, in income supports. This is a real issue, and this is where the involvement of upper levels of government will become important. But there's things we can do in our community right now, particularly on the greatest pressures, things like addictions, mental health. The five consciously make a greater investment in those and do it, as I say, in a thoughtful and systemic way. And that's the idea behind the health report.
And as you mentioned, the opioid crisis in particular has even been worsened by the pandemic, and in Barrie in particular.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah, and so there's been some residents that I've talked to that say Barrie City Council or the city in general hasn't done enough to combat that, specifically within the context of the pandemic. What part of the budget or what part of the operating procedures will change or address that need in the?
Well, I guess the challenge with that is, it's not, unlike in Toronto and Ottawa, for example, public health is not a department of the city. So we don't set their budget. Their budget is set by a board that is comprised of 28, I think, different municipalities in Simcoe, Muskoka. So I'm certainly in favor of increasing funding to public health because they are leading the fight against opioids. Of course, the biggest problem right now is public health, who have very limited resources, and we're facing cuts before COVID, are also the people who are leading the fight against the pandemic. So you've had them trying to fight two very dangerous epidemics, the poison drugs and opioids, at the same time as COVID, and they worsen. In fact, they worsen each other. So the core answer to your question, Sam, is that public health needs more funding, and that will come in part from municipalities, in part from the province. Unfortunately, it's not really a decision of Barrie City Council. So that's going to be an interesting question: is what else might we do? And I think for many people who would hear that answer, they'll say, well, you're dodging the question, Mayor Lehman, and why aren't you guys doing more? I think that gets wrapped up with the council's position on a supervised consumption site. And in my opinion, we need to support a supervised consumption site and get one up and running in the city of Barrie, because that is the harm reduction that can prevent people from dying long enough to get them into treatment. I guess the last thing I would say is one of the huge steps we made in 2020 was to get an agreement with Cornerstone to Recovery, which is a women's treatment facility specifically targeting opioids. We're going to be one of the very, very few cities in the entire country that has residential treatment for women to recover from opioid addiction. And it's being funded by a social enterprise. Cornerstone's model is actually textile recycling, which is wonderful because the people in the program is social enterprise, and it allows them to grow what they do. So we are doing more, and I think we've done it in a very innovative way by providing them with $400,000. So short answer to your question on budget, we're giving $400,000 to build residential treatment in Barrie. But in addition to that, we are partnering with them to create this textile recycling enterprise that will fund their operations.
And as you mentioned on Monday night, and as the discussion kind of went, that the County of Simcoe provides a lot of these services that I referred to before, right? And the City of Barrie funds a lot of those services, but some of the services are operated in other municipalities, other areas of the county. Going forward, addressing the County of Simcoe's budget, what kind of steps can council take, or what can be done to bring some of those services or bring more of those services within Barrie? And talking about health services and addictions in particular.
Yeah, and that's a great question too. And this was an issue on Monday night. And I think it's going to be a bit of a growing issue because, for example, this year the city of Barrie is spending $3 million on an affordable housing project in Bradford, which for a lot of Barrie residences won't work well because housing is run by Simcoe on a region-wide basis. So there will be people end up with a unit in Bradford, and the way it works, they don't necessarily have to take it. They can try and wait for a unit in Barrie. But the point being that central intake for social housing is county-wide, and it includes the separated cities. Eventually, that you build here, you build there around the county. You also build in Barrie, and as Mr. Wilcox was saying in his presentation Monday night, the county has been selling some scattered units of their own social housing in Barrie to fund a major new project, and we expect to hear some more details on that in 2021. I think that will help answer some of the questions because most of the major investment in affordable housing by the county directly has not been in Barrie. But I guess another thing I would say on that is, there's been concerns by many in our community over the years about, well, all the social services are in Barrie, and that creates additional pressure on us as a community to be the social service hub for everybody else in Central Ontario. And part of the solution to that is having services where people live in smaller cities. So when you get a build in Aurelia or Busby starting to work out of the cold in Collingwood and those sorts of things, you're actually kind of taking pressure off Barrie as well. And allowing our organizations to be able to do more to help people here.
Okay. And as Council noted on Monday again, and I'm going to loop this back into discussion of the police budget just because I don't want to skip over it here. The requested or suggested 15% decrease in the library's projected operating budget. Some were confused about why the library was expected to cut that budget, whereas the police budget is rising. And one comment in particular on Twitter said that reflected the priorities of City Council. Do you have a comment on that about the kind of comparison between library funding seemingly getting an ask to be cut, whereas the police are growing?
So the library actually is growing by something in the order of 12 to 15%.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I didn't mean
the police are 2%.
Yeah, so I didn't mean the overall. Just the.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe the tone of the discussion, because there were some councillors saying, "Oh, library, you should cut your operating costs." But what we need to remember is the library was coming back to open a new branch, and that branch initially had a price tag of $800,000 for the year, which, if you're counting, is about a 12% increase in the library's budget, and the police came in with a 2% increase. So I think that's why you saw, the library obviously had a huge increase relative. But I think the comment around, does council prioritize the police over libraries? I would say that if we're even with the 15% cut, which the library did itself, the library board themselves went back and said, okay, we can reduce our operating costs for the new branch. If council approves a 10% increase instead of 12 for the library, it's still a much larger increase than the police budget. And, we're building a new library. And I think that's wonderful. I mean, my own view is that library, some people question any different spending priority. Library tends to sometimes be questioned more. I don't think that should be the case. I'm a huge believer in our public library. And when we built the first branch, it was more successful even than envisioned. And I think this one will be too. The specific issue on Monday night, just so you know, Sam, I think at one point the library came forward and said, we can open a new branch without hiring any more staff. We can just move some people over. And I think that proved to be too optimistic. When they came back, they had a very large $800,000 budget for that branch. And I think some councillors said, wait a minute, you said you could do that with existing staff. So that's what led them, I think, to go back and the discussion you heard.
And on the note of COVID-19's impact on some of these services like libraries, rec centers, everything like that, the city posted a projected like 5.5 million decrease in revenue from those services. I was wondering, could you talk a little bit of what else people might expect to see as far as COVID-19's impact on the budget going forward?
Yeah, I mean, the big ticket concerns or big ticket impacts from COVID are on transit revenues because transit ridership. Actually, what happened was it cratered in April during the first wave. Then it built back up, and actually, Barrie, we saw our ridership build back up more than many similar, sort of bus-based transit systems around Ontario. It's gone down again, obviously, with the lockdown and the progressively tightening restrictions, and I expect as of tomorrow it'll drop quite a bit more as well. So that's a big impact. I mean, that's many millions. Depends on how long the lockdown lasts and how quickly it lifts. The other big impact, obviously, is in things like recreation centers, senior centers, and theaters, all of which are closed at the moment. So rec centers, all those program fees, whether it's a toonie swim or your, $40 gym membership, a lot of those revenues won't come in, obviously, while they're closed, and they'll probably come back slowly in some cases as well. So, the projection's a projection. Things are changing seemingly weekly. Unfortunately, things aren't getting better at the moment. So I think if there's anything we know right now, it's that probably we're going to end up on the downside of those projections, not the upside. But staff make the best guess they can for budget purposes, and then we'll deal with it as it comes.
And I want to be mindful of your time, so I just have a couple more questions here.
Sure.
But specifically about development and planning. And I know a lot of this is not within the municipality's control, specifically like the population targets that the province sets. But going forward into the new year and into the next decade, it seems like from the budget that Barrie is getting ready for this population boom, right? With a big capital investment in roads, everything like that. Could you kind of talk about how this budget intersects with this kind of new plan for Barrie in terms of meeting that 258,000 population goal?
Yeah. Well, suburban growth is really expensive from a capital budget point of view. It is not very efficient in terms of the way money is spent on infrastructure because you're running pipes out in a very low density sprawling pattern. It's harder to support transit, which means lower ridership. We, partly empty buses and all that sort of thing. So we've consciously shifted the way Barrie is growing to intensify, and that's quite obvious when you drive up something like Essa Road and see mid-rise and high-rise buildings. And it's certainly very obvious in the planning approvals that have been given over the last 6 months in the downtown core and the area around it. We're seeing dramatic change in the built form in Barrie. But we are still going to build some suburban communities because we want to build a range of housing for people at all times of their life and all family circumstances and things. So you want to mix, and that comes with different infrastructure costs and priorities. I think one of the big things that's different this time around is we negotiated voluntary contributions from developers to make sure that growth actually paid for growth. So the development charge regime in Ontario historically only collected between 60 and 70% of the cost of growth, and existing municipal residents, taxpayers, ended up footing the rest of it, the cost for growth, which wasn't really fair. The DC regime got a little better, but it always had a statutory deduction and a bunch of exemptions. And in Barrie, we negotiated a separate agreement with the developers, the landowners groups in Hewitt's and Salem secondary plans, for them to pay those extra costs. And they agreed to do that. So while no formula is perfect, we're probably as close as you're ever going to get in Ontario to growth actually paying for growth. And that's reflected in the budget. The biggest challenge for the city is that when you open new facilities, whether it's a rec center or a library or a fire station, you got to staff it. And so you take a big jump up, whether it's 40 new people working in a rec center, 20 fighters, it's a jump in 1 year. And that's why the library has like that 10% budget increase this year. And you got to be prepared for that. So this budget helps us ramp towards that. And that's another really important thing that we're doing. Although with the pressure on the tax rate this year that I'm sure is going to come, and I have some proposals to offset that, I think it's going to be tough for us to ramp much in 2020. But then, we're going to have to get ready for it in 2021. We're really going to have to get ready for it in the coming years because those tall buildings are coming, and in the suburban areas more slowly, the homes are coming.
And those tax rate plans that you mentioned, and those proposals that you mentioned, maybe to offset that, could you go into detail about that a little bit?
Well, I'll give you a sneak preview. I want to sort of put those in front of council and the public more broadly through the process. But for example, we do have some contingency reserves that are meant, for example, something called the tax rate stabilization reserve. It's a very Keynesian concept. You build it up in years when you can, and you draw it when you need it. And it is meant to smooth unusual impacts. We certainly have some unusual impacts this year, both with COVID and with the broader economy. So I'm going to suggest we use a bit of that, but you got to be really careful when you use once that multi-year costs, because you just dig a bigger hole the next year. So more broadly, I'd like us to do some sustainable things. And I think what that's going to have to look like is pausing some capital projects. So just what we were talking about a minute ago, we have had growth occur a little more slowly in Barrie than planned. We may be able to push off some projects, and staff have already done that. But also, I think we've had a very aggressive program, which included a 1% levy on the tax increase every year to do more infrastructure renewal, literally fixing more roads, pipes, and old buildings. That's been pretty aggressive in the sense that we've asked our residents every single year for 1% more. It's now generating almost 30 a year. We could maybe stop the 1% growth for a year, put that on hold, just collect the $30 million instead of 33 kind of thing, as it grows. And that is a sustainable thing. It's not a sustainable thing to do over the long term, but it doesn't create a hole necessarily for next year. If as a consequence you say, okay, I'm also not going to do that $2.5 or $3 million of capital work that we were planning to do. With tough choices, but I think this year, we might want to do that. And the last thing I'll say is, for 10 years, I've fought debt at the city. I've taken it out at budget time, out of the plan through amendment to the budget motions. This might be the year where we take advantage of record low borrowing rates. I'm starting to think our kids are going to thank us if we're smart about how we finance these projects right now. The city can borrow money at 1.2, 1.3%. And while you never, ever want to start getting really dependent on debt, and the city, by the way, can't run a deficit like the feds in the province. But if we're going to issue debt for big projects, just like a mortgage to buy your house, it's a really good time to do it. And, if those rates are going to go up 5 years from now, maybe we should do that this year and take some of the pressure both off taxpayers and take advantage of the low borrowing rate. So I'll have more to say on that, but that's part of the strategy I want to put forward.
And I guess as the budget talks begin in earnest, what conversations do you think will be the most important to watch for, or kind of stir the most debate or discussion? What do you think the top of the priority is?
Well, we know we're going to want to bring the tax rate down from the proposed 3.6% increase down. I think the question is how we do that. That'll be the big question, and the question that people should ask us and hold us to account for is whether or not we're doing it in a sustainable way, or call it a politically expeditious way. It's easy to pull one-time funding and look good for a year, but you're digging yourself a fiscal hole that future councils will have to dig themselves out of, and future taxpayers will end up being worse off. So are we doing it in a thoughtful way? And that also goes for service levels, because I haven't heard from people in Barrie that they want their services cut or are willing to have services cut. So this might be the hold the course year. And if we're able to do that and deliver a very low increase, I think that's probably where council wants to go. And what people should hold our feet to the fire on is the service choices that we're making, if any. Are we doing this in a sustainable way? Are we still moving the city forward at all? Or are we at least doing the best we can under the circumstances to be smart about how we're handling public?
Perfect. Well, thank you.